Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's virtual program, Strategic Planning for Nonprofit Excellence, Building Vision, Alignment, and Impact with David Moore. I am Brittany Spillman, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Carey Center's Community and Collegiate Programs. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make programs like this possible. Our presenting sponsor for today is the Walker Area Community Foundation, a nonprofit grant-making organization that works every day to build permanent resources, spark meaningful conversations, inspire action, and empower partners to make a difference. We are also grateful to our community and collegiate program sponsors, Auburn University Outreach, Auburn University Outreach Office of Public Service, the Drummond Thorne Stooks Fund for Excellence, and a community service grant made possible by State Representative Joe Lovern. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, David Moore. David is the president of Moore Strategic Consulting, LLC. As an accomplished executive with over 30 years of experience in the education and nonprofit sector, David leads project teams and organizations to produce results consistently. David has been both an effective leader within nonprofit organizations and a trusted advisor and consultant providing strategic leadership, facilitation, and project oversight. David's consulting clients range from small local to large national organizations where he is a trusted partner to develop and implement strategic plans. He is a recognized national expert in the implementation of broad collective impact and collaboration efforts. His strategic planning and initiative support includes working with the foundations, arts organizations, social service providers, and advocacy organizations. Please join me in welcoming David Moore.
Hey, everybody. It's great to be here. Really thrilled to get the chance to present. I'm based just up and over the road in Nashville, Tennessee, but thrilled to get the chance to connect with all of you and share some of the work I get to do with colleagues like yourselves around the country and really get to enjoy doing on strategic planning and want to sort of, as much as possible, turn this into a conversation. So I do hope you'll use the chat, you'll come off mute, you'll slow me down, you'll ask questions. I'm sort of, my bread and butter is facilitation and engagement, not sort of standing in the front of the room and presenting. So I'd rather have a conversation along the way today and share some stories and examples and some tools and tricks. I really hope that by the time we finish, I've been able to give you some concrete ideas that you might be able to use in your own efforts or some thoughts about sort of next steps and how to proceed. Um, my objectives for the day are really to help talk about the purpose of strategic planning, why we do it and what it is, some basic processes that I've learned to use that are successful in trying to help bring people through the process, and to talk about some of the strategies that work inside that process. It's not a mystery. There are some sort of really concrete steps you can take to get clarity with people. And I'm glad to try and offer the advice of what sort of we've learned to do on both myself and colleagues I work with when we do this work. I'm literally in the middle of trying to write final strategic frameworks for 4 different organizations right now. It's been a spring and summer of strategic planning for me. So this was fun to put together the PowerPoints and think about sort of how the work evolves over time for me. Um, I really want to start with some answers in the chat or maybe somebody or one or two of you to come off mute. Why do we do strategic planning? Like, what's the answer to why if we're going to spend the time and effort? What do we hope to get out of it? What are your top of the head reactions? Like, why do we do it?
To set and meet goals.
So we need goals. We got to know where we're going, right? Sustainability. We got to know how to grow over time. Would anybody say to make my board happy? See a few smiling faces. So a few folks do have board issues. Community relationships, so connections, right? Um, so I think those are all correct and all of the kinds of different ways we come at it. For me, it's a chance to figure out where we're going and what we're doing. So Chelsea, your points directly on purpose here. Like, what's our mission? Where are we headed? And I would say it's a chance to help you make priorities, set priorities. Like, you can't do everything, so what are you going to do? Right. So I often talk about strategic planning as putting up a fence. Like, how do I know what's in and what's out of my work? And some of you may have had the experience of living in a place where there's no fence and it's hard to know where the boundaries are, and you're not quite sure where your piece of property starts and the next one starts. Um, how do you sort of get a fence up that tells you this is our universe, it's the universe we want to play in, and how do we know it? I also describe it as the writing down and an intentional declaration of intention. It's saying to yourselves and to the outside world, here's what we intend to do. Doesn't mean we're going to succeed at all of it, but we intend to do these things. And hopefully it provides some clarity for internally facing. So like we can sort of speed things up. So I would argue that a really well done strategic planning process and set of goals makes things move faster internally because people know what their work is, they know what direction they're supposed to go, and they can sort of make faster decisions. I put this last bullet on today because I've been battling this a little bit. It is not a branding or marketing effort. It can be the precursor to branding, marketing, and communications plans. But I often experience people in the middle of strategic planning trying to say, well, we need a good punchy slogan, and our mission statement ought to sound like a slogan. And I'm often of the mind remind people that actually that's not its purpose. And you let the communications people use your strategic framework to write really cool slogans and write really good messaging. They obviously are overlapping circles. They obviously relate to each other, but be cautious about strategic planning turning into a communications exercise because it's first about strategic clarity, right? It's about who are we and where are we going and what's most important, not what's the best way to message who are we and where are we going and what are we about. And they're slightly different things, and there are professionals who are really good at how do we say what you're doing after you've gotten clear about what you're doing. So, um, does that make sense? Think about putting up a fence when you're doing strategic planning. What's the product we're after? I'm going to sort of put this up because for a while it was a big deal. It's sort of we're treating it in the background. Most people have learned this distinction. For a while in the universe, strategic plans were big, thick notebooks or, 30, 40, 50, 100-page documents that tried to say, here's everything that's going to happen each of the next 3, 4, 5 years. Turns out it's impossible to predict the future. And trying to be that detailed about the next 3, 4, 5 years is almost impossible. So the shift, and this is from Board Source, is away from plans to what we call a strategic framework, right? To quickly and effectively respond within a set of a framework that we still know where we're headed. And then normally what I coach people on is how to go from a framework into an annual operational plan that sets, okay, if these are our big goals, here's what we're doing this year. And then we can align budgets and other kinds of things to the annual operating plans. So if you're still in the school of thought that what you need is a 30, 40, 50-page document, I'd encourage you to sort of unpack that a little bit and try and sort of think about how to think about shorter frameworks in the universe. I don't think that's as big a deal anymore as it used to be. This next slide, I'm going to take a minute on because this is sort of the big picture that's always in my head about planning. But I want to comment first on the word planning. Um, I don't talk about going to do a strategic plan with anybody. Strategic planning is an activity, it is an exercise of people working together to share in the decision making about the future of an organization. The written framework at the end of the day is just a reflection of the conversations, decisions, and direction setting that happened in the room in the conversations. So for me, it's really important to constantly think about it as um, a forward activity that people are involved in, and that what we need to do is create ownership and commitment to a final set of statements. And then at the end of the day, the writing it down is just, the last step in the process. So for me, strategic planning is a funnel, right? And our first responsibility is to think across the top. what is the reality of the universe we face? What are all the issues and possibilities? What's our current context? Like, what do we know about ourselves and the current world we sit in? And what do we know about what might be emerging in the world we sit in? Right. And it should, in fact, make room for lots of possibilities. And then we have to run a set of processes that bring us down the funnel. You know, how do we sort among all the possibilities of things we might want to do, given who we are as an organization? And how do we sort of start to think about the trade-offs between prioritizing one kind of thing over another to and then eventually get to a clear set of goals that line up with a mission? And so this can take a really long time with lots of steps or be a pretty accelerated process. Depends on a lot of things, from size and scale of complexity of your work to where you are in your own context of understanding the landscape around you. Sometimes people, are trying to do a reset and they spend a lot of time at the top of the funnel because we really want to understand what's happening around us. And so we do a lot of listening and we do a lot of surveying and we do a lot of digging in. Other times we have a pretty good sense of the world around us, but we're facing a couple of really important choices. And so we've got to move into the middle pretty quick and spend our time there. So again, but the picture is sort of key. And I would encourage you to sort of learn how to orient where you are in a process along this kind of picture. So who do we involve in strategic planning? The left side list here, leadership staff, board committee, and the full board are sort of essentials. Like I won't do a process that doesn't include the key leaders of the organization who are the staff. Usually there's a strategic planning committee or core small committee that we often treat as a task force. That's the leadership of staff and a board committee working together. So it's sort of almost 50-50 in the room together. And then loops with the full board. One, if not two loops with a full board. And that's sort of a standard process for us. When we have time and possibilities, I really like to engage the full staff. If you're a larger organization, we really like to do a full staff engagement to make sure everybody from the very front lines all the way through are weighing in and making sure that we're sort of making reasonable and smart decisions about what's possible. Volunteers, other partners, other key stakeholders. I've kicked off, sort of top of the funnel activities with um, I'll reference a project a couple years ago where we worked with the Nashville Symphony Orchestra to write a new strategic framework, and we started with 100 people in a room who literally represented every blue square on this page, in a really broad sort of engagement around what's possible and what's the role of a symphony and how do we think about that. And it was a really fantastic way to sort of generate excitement and possibility and interest in how do we think about the symphony for the future, right? And you can tap that excitement and leverage it forward. So again, it's context driven, it's timing, it's size of complexity of organization, all those things change how you do this. But I would encourage everybody to think about these buckets as they do this work. How does it play out? So process. Um, Please throw questions in now as we start to get into nuts and bolts because I can rush through this. Um, Usually it's 3 to 4 phases of work. You need to spend some time looking at the top. Good strategic planning gives us a minute to look at our existing materials. What are the surveys we've done? What have we listened to from our board? What have we heard from the people we serve and work with? And do we need to go do some more listening and engaging, or do we know enough, right? Sometimes you can dig into your own data and information and really, but what you have to do is you have to stop and look at it and say, wait a minute, we've been collecting this data. What does it tell us? Right? Often you can do a SWOT, and we'll talk about that in a minute here in this first phase. It's a great way to organize. While SWOTs get a bad name and people will roll their eyes at them, they're actually a really great way to organize. What do we know about our contexts, opportunities and threats, and who we are as an organization, strengths and weaknesses? And when those can be informed by data, or sort of input from folks outside the organization, that's really powerful stuff. Instead of just the people's opinions who do it every day. So encourage you to do that. I don't want to sound like I'm pitching working with a consultant or a facilitator as I do this presentation. In fact, I'll talk about keys to doing that if you choose to work with one. But I will say that there's an opportunity at the early part of this for somebody to get neutral feedback. So it's one thing for a board member or a CEO to call a couple of key supporters orders and ask for feedback on the organization, sometimes you get very different information when somebody who's not viewed as associated with the organization, right? Who's a neutral interviewer will say things that haven't been said. So, think about sort of what you need to know and who the people are you want to learn from, and make sure you get good evidence on the front end. The middle of this work is really the nuts and bolts of making choices, right? How do we take our aspirations, who we want to be in the universe, the challenges we know we face moving forward, and start to say what's most important going forward, given who we are? And what does that mean for our work if we choose those priorities, right? And that's where we have to wrestle with trade-offs. And I'm going to try and talk about key ways to figure that out at each step. So the aspirations and challenges and setting of priorities, there are some very simple ways to ask certain questions in a room that'll get you your first draft of priorities, right? Aligned to a mission statement. So I'm going to talk about both those steps in a minute. Um, and then the third step is really checking yourself against those priorities. Often what we do is this is where we like to engage the full staff. We'll take what emerged from the task force and the board around priorities and possible ideas, and we'll go into the staff and say, okay, I'll take all the work we do now and tell me where it fits these priorities. Like, where does it already align? And do we have some stuff we do now that we can't figure out where it goes? And what does that tell us? Is it going to stay aligned or not? And if we try and do these 3 or 4 big priorities or goals, can we actually do it? Like, or are we setting ourselves up for failure because we overshot? And my basic take is there's nobody better prepared to answer that question except the people who will have to do the work. I didn't say it up at the other slide, but I actually won't do strategic planning with a board only. The boards don't have enough knowledge and information about the day-to-day work of the organization to set the direction for the organization by themselves. They're really important to setting direction for the organization, but we shouldn't ask them to do it by themselves. We need to let the staff and the people who live it and do it every day sort of have strong voices in that conversation. So I'm glad to sort of engage that discussion with anybody who's interested, but it's really critical to me that it's a balanced conversation coming through the process. I'm going to pause and see if anybody has a question here about sort of process or steps.
You're welcome to type it in the chat, or you're welcome to also unmute, whichever you choose.
Okay, I'm glad to go backwards at any point. Let me cover a couple of very specific things. So mission statements are often one of the places that people can get hung up on. And I've just learned a couple of rules about trying to craft mission statements, right? So first of all, you can't write a mission statement by committee. So you have to always be cautious not to get into editing, right? You have to focus on meaning. It turns out, and if you've not heard of the book, the Engine of Impact, that came out in 2018 by me and Junker, it's a great set of conditions for highly successful nonprofits, and I'd encourage it to everybody. One of their chapters is about the primacy of mission, and they talk about the role that really strong and clear strategic mission statements play in essentially setting up the first version of offense. And a well-written mission statement tells you what's in your work and what's not in your work, and can help you make decisions about what's in your work and not your work. And I spent some time with the examples they give and sort of work through it a little bit. And essentially, they always answer 3 questions: who do you work with? Who do you work with? How do you do your work? And to what end is your work intended? So it gives you some sense of, oh, this organization is doing this kind of work with these folks to accomplish these things. And what I'll do now, so I'm going to give away my secret sauce, is I won't tell people we're writing a mission statement. I won't even put it on the agenda. But if we've decided we want to work on mission, I'll just go in and put these 3 questions up on 3 chart paper. And I'll ask everybody individually to write their own answer to: who does this organization work with? How do you do your work? And to what end are you trying to move the results? And then I let everybody sort of put their answers up together. Sometimes we do small groups, large group, depends on the size and all that kind of stuff. And you end up with 3 lists, but lots of common overlap of like, okay, And I've actually learned that by the time I get those three charts on the wall, I can read a new mission statement across the three charts, right? And sometimes it's a little long and clunky when we do it that way, but then it's an editing process, right? And so I'm going to give you an example of what I mean, right? So the Nashville Symphony, when we started working with them, had previously had a mission statement that was literally a paragraph long and didn't include the word orchestra or music in the paragraph. And they knew it wasn't a helpful paragraph. Like it tried to do too many things. And so we worked a process, and in one sentence could say, the Nashville Symphony inspires and engages a diverse and growing community with extraordinary live orchestral music experiences. So who do they work with? Diverse and growing community. How do they do their work? Extraordinary live orchestral musical experiences. To what end? Inspire and engage. Like you can answer all three questions in one sentence, right? And what we worked with them on is like, when you do it really well, you can. I said to them, like, look, you can walk around every day with three questions in your head. Who was in the room, right? Did it reflect a diverse and growing community? Did we have an extraordinary live music experience? And how would we know it was extraordinary? And did we inspire and engage the audience, right? We can ask three questions about every single performance, every single educational program, every single thing to check whether or not we're on mission, right? When you can get to that level of a conversation, now you've got a mission statement that helps people make decisions, right? So for them, the phrase extraordinary live orchestral music experiences was really fundamentally important because it reinforced this notion that our job is live performances. It's not recordings over here, it's not publishing over here. It's the live musical performance. And how does that then cause us to make choices about our work and other kinds of things? So, um, you know, sometimes people ask me to look at their mission statements, and I still bring these three questions to it. So I can do a whole hour on mission statements, and I could have given you 10 more examples. I won't do that. But it's a really useful way to think about how to create something that really can guide you and you can walk around with in your work. So I'd encourage you to do that. Um, So different strategies to use throughout the process. I wanted to take a minute and sort of comment on these. And if you've had success or frustrations with any of these, I hope you'll say something and we can talk about sort of what makes them work and what doesn't make them work. SWOT analysis, again, are pretty straightforward practices that people have done. Strengths and weakness of the organization, those are the internal facing questions. Opportunities and threats are things in the environment that are either true or you're worried will be true. And generating those lists can really help people think about, okay, how do we work with what we have as an organization to accomplish what we want, our mission, in the context we see? And that's essentially what you're setting up with that conversation. If you know force field analysis, which is a similar exercise, where you think about what you're trying to accomplish and what are the forces pushing up to help you and what are the forces pushing down that are in your way. It's another way to have the same conversation about sort of what's helping us move where we want to go. Um, to folks who are involved in the work every day, some of these exercises can feel sort of obvious. Yeah, of course, this is what we know about ourselves and what's going on. Remember, I describe strategic planning as an active, engaging activity. Right. So I'll do SWATs early in the process or some version of that conversation early in the process because I need everybody to steal the familiar parable. I need everybody to see the whole elephant. Right. The story of the five blind guys touching an elephant, and one describes the trunk and one describes a foot and one describes a tail. And so you get not everybody, nobody's seeing the whole elephant, right? And what we're trying to do is make sure the board leadership, the staff leadership who come at it from different perspectives, right? You run different parts of the organization. Is everybody seeing the same elephant in the same universe? So you've got to take the time to do that. Otherwise, you're going to be setting priorities based on people only seeing a piece of the puzzle, right? So taking enough time at the top of the funnel, remember, is critical to building ownership to the choices that come next. Um, Interviews and surveys are pretty standard things at the top of the triangle to tap and use. To the extent you're used to and have expertise in those things, that's great. Use them, drive forward with them. This is the place where I will tell people, look, AI is not perfect, but it can help you speed these processes up, and give you a window into sort of the big picture and the themes you're seeing along the way. The trick is to use it as an opening for a conversation, not as is this the gospel that tells us what to do, right? So you can accelerate into these things in productive ways right now, and there's some great tools, and they're only getting better. So if you're inclined to think that way, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what are the best ways to do it and what aren't, um, and glad to sort of talk about sort of things I've used and not had success with and have had success with in the space. I'm going to add two commentaries on the AI debate. Um, One is there are problems with it, but it's also right now the worst it's ever going to be. So the products get better every day, problems get solved every day. If you think you understand what you're looking at today, it's going to change in 2 weeks. It's kind of amazing how fast it changes. Um, and you know, be clear about what you're up to and use the tool as a tool, not as a replacement for who you are as an organization. So um, glad to come back to that if you want. So scenario planning. Some of you may or may not know scenario planning exercises. It can be really helpful to talk about sort of what are the alternate future universes we face. And there are some really great tools that have been produced about how to do this that you set up the way forces are affecting you into quadrants that produce different scenarios. And you can start to talk about, look, there's a response we need in all 3 or 4 scenarios. And so if we need it, no matter what happens, then we've got to make sure we do it. Right. And then there are conversations about, well, we only need to do that if X or Y happens. And how do we know and what are our triggers? Like for folks who feel like they're in a highly dynamic, shifting environment, scenario planning can lead to really productive conversations about what do we know we have to do and what do we have to be ready to do? And how do you sort of build that into your plan? So depending on context, it's a really useful tool. The other thing I like to do a lot for folks is benchmarking. Who are the other 3 or 4 organizations that you look to who do similar work? And what can we learn about those other organizations to talk about what you do and what you could learn from that? Um, and I think boards get a lot out of realizing your work is not, you're not the only one in the universe doing what you do, and other people have made different choices about how to do the work as a way to lean in. And so that can be done sort of quick and dirty by reading websites and looking at a couple 990s and putting them on a grid, or it can get really involved and dig in and even do interviews with similar organizations to frame up ideas. So, but again, you can do a really basic level of it just to sort of help yourself have the conversation about what might be possible. And I like to use it a lot actually to help spark, especially for board members and especially for smaller organizations with small staffs. You often have a dedicated set of board members who maybe even help build the organization or create it. And they know what they know in your community and in your work, but they may not realize there are 6 organizations like theirs in other cities around the country. And oh, let's look for a minute at what choices they made. They're doing that differently than we are, or we've never thought about doing that. Like it can be for board members who don't live in the day-to-day world of what the organization does, it can be a great way to expand their thinking about what's possible. CEOs who've often thought, I'd like to go do X or Y, I'll say, well, let's show them some organizations that do that. So it's not doesn't have to be your idea that they start to say, oh, those are cool ideas, right? I mean, it's a great way to sort of pull in an expansive thinking into the conversation. We're at a half hour already. Look at this. All right. I'm trying to watch for questions in the chat. So thanks for the introductions and who you are. So without planning, how do you execute on your mission? A vision without a goal or plan is just a dream. Some great comments, avoiding mission drifts. Yeah. All really, really good responses to why we have to do this, right? And you've got to sort of, for me, there are layers. I'm going to show you an example here in a minute of how you layer the thing together in a framework so that you're answering a core set of questions. I think the last really critical conversation that I think lots of people skip over, and I used to until I realized I was missing a key part of the conversation, is every nonprofit has a business model. And there's some great articles about sort of the range of business models. If you know Jim Collins is Good to Great for the social sector, his little red book. There's a great little matrix in there about sort of the different business models for nonprofits. There's a great um, SSIR article from 15 years ago about different ways to sort of create a business model for organizations. And they're really productive conversations. But the fundamental part of the conversation is what drives revenue in to, because revenue's fuel. Like, how do you get to move your organization forward? So let me give you an example. I had an organization after COVID that was, I was being asked to help organizations think about how they were adjusting and being flexible. And they got on the phone with me and they wanted to talk about how to build out their donor fundraising. They had hired their first development person and they really wanted to build out donor fundraising. And I kept asking questions and trying to unpack sort of what they were getting at. And this is a really large organization serving a big region of the state with direct human services support, case management, interventions, mental health services. And the more I unpacked with them, I did the math and I said back to them, I was like, wait a minute, 85% of your revenue is direct fee for service reimbursement from the state. And they're like, yeah, that's where our money comes from. That's how we pay our bills. And I said, okay, cool. You're trying to do individual fundraising, but who's your lobbyist for reimbursement rates from the state? Like, aren't you under a much bigger risk if the state guts funding for the work you do? Because they're like, oh, well, we don't have a lobbyist. I was like, maybe we're investing in the wrong part of the business model. Like, your anchor business model is driven by a certain set of decision makers and behaviors. And for you not to have built an infrastructure to engage that business model seemed like a mess, right? So to them, it just was sort of obvious. Well, we get paid. It felt like it would be that way forever. And I sort of encouraged, like, I wouldn't assume it's going to be that way forever, right? Those decisions matter and you ought to be engaged in those decisions, right? So that's a simplistic example. But one of the most important things I do as a consultant who comes in, and you can do this for yourself, um, and apologies to CFOs on the line, but a lot of CFOs don't even really think this way. Like, how do you get up a level? How do you look at the categories of revenue and how they've changed over time? So I'll get people to put their revenue in 3 or 4 categories and look at it over 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years. Like, what parts of revenue are growing, what aren't? And what does that tell us about the organization and what the forces are affecting us? And what does that mean about how we have to adjust and manage our work? Because it tells us something about who we are. Um, I tell people all the time, you can say all day long, you can tell me all day long who you are and what you do, but your budget tells me what you actually do and who you really are, right? And how you spend your money tells me who you are, and where your money comes from tells me how your business operates and what the fundamentals are. So it's a bit of a long rant, but it's a missed conversation in way too many of these processes. And so I really encourage you, whatever sort of stage you are at strategic planning, is start to ask yourself meaningful questions and share with your board how you understand and see the business model for the organization. Because boards often don't understand this and they get distracted by the wrong things, because we're not talking about it in clear enough ways. So enough on that. I'll come back around if you want to talk more about it. But it's, for me, it's a fundamental piece of the conversation that has to happen in planning. So how do we get from everything that's possible to a set of goals? People always ask me this question, like, David, we've got all this stuff on the wall. How are we going to make choices? How are we going to get them to set goals for the organization? And it's not really a mystery. It's a simple set of questions. And the essential question that I ask people to do in a room, usually this is that task force of board members and senior staff. Sometimes it's the whole board. If we imagine we're wildly successful in this context, what we know about ourselves and the mission we've set out for ourselves, if we're wildly successful 5 years, 3 years from now, how will we know? What might we see? Right? And some people will talk about, well, our programs have grown. Other people will talk about we have new programs. Other people will talk about, right? And what you can do pretty quickly is somebody's got to be sorting and organizing. But in most of my experience, the answers to this question are easily organized into 4, 5, or 6 categories of things. We're going to be up to this, we'll be up to this, we'll be up to this. And you can start to see them. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. The implication of that would be to see that work, we would have to do X, right? And that's essentially your first statement of a goal. We would have to make this true. We would have to make this true. We would have to make this true. We would have to make this true, right? And so at the end of that discussion, you can pretty quickly write your first drafts of, I don't always call them goal statements right away. I often say, well, here's our emerging priorities for the future. So what would it look like if we got there? Like, what are the goals we want, right? And you start to organize and sort. So I have an organization I'm in the middle of working with that we were trying to come down the funnel, right? And we had left a big meeting with a bunch of board and leadership folks and had over time identified essentially 6 possible goals for the organization. And that was really great because I could write these really concise goals. And then the next step was to take those into the task force and say, okay, let's unpack each of these. What would it take to do each of these 6 goals, right? And in the conversation about how to actually do each goal, we realized it was really only 3 goals, right? That we had things that were about accomplishing one of the others, but we could only do that in the conversation. This is where it's really key to like spend the time having the conversation, because we left that room with now a team of senior leaders who are like, oh, this is totally cool. Now we know what our 3 priorities are for the future and what we're going to do. Like they had this ownership and excitement about how they had gone from all this confusion to 3 really clear sort of anchor points for the future. And that for me is the objective. Not that we have the 3 statements, yes, that's important, but that we had excitement and ownership and commitment to those ideas, because that's what causes a plan to be meaningful and useful, right? Does that make sense? So I can't see enough nodding heads. You guys are all, yeah. But so to me, that's sort of the key unlocking question or a version of it. So there are 2 links here, so you have them when the slides go out. I'm going to switch to showing you a couple of examples. I'm glad to give you both of these tools. Um, the first thing I'm going to pull up is just a simple template framework for what you're trying to accomplish with strategic planning. So you don't have to have every single one of these elements. In fact, I'm agnostic on whether or not vision statements are helpful. Usually you can collect 20 vision statements from nonprofits and they all sound the same. They don't tend to provide much strategic clarity or help you like make decisions. So if it helps you be clear about sort of the change you want in the world, great, write one. I'm not against it. Mission statement we talked about. So this is our role and purpose in creating the world we want, right? It should give you a sign to what we're up to. Oftentimes, the how we do our work section is literally the kinds of behaviors we're going to put into the world. So I have an organization now that's going to educate, convene, and advocate, right? So they wrote 3 clear statements under how we do our work. That's about what does it mean for us to do education? What does it mean for us to do convening? What does it mean for us to do advocacy, right? So they're big buckets. That's sort of an optional thing, but for some folks, it provides real clarity to the work. Most organizations already have or build a value statement that's really sort of the lens through which all the work should be done. Um, you can build those into this process. You can use the ones you've already got, but they often should travel along with this. And then the process near the bottom of the funnel is designed to write very clear goals. And I push hard for the goal statements to be something we can see in the future. It'll be true, and it's written like something that could be accomplished, right? And then underneath each of those goals, we try and say, what are the evidence points? What are the progress indicators that we can look forward to 3 to 5 years? So usually 2 or 3 per goal get you a sense of, oh, that'll look like A or B in the world, right? And then underneath the goal, objectives or sometimes strategies are what we're going to do to accomplish the goal. There are categories of activities to move towards a goal. Again, 3 to 5 objectives or strategies per goal. There's often and then the last section for me, I call support goals. Sometimes this is a distinction that doesn't have to be transparent, but I work hard to make sure that strategic goals are the things we want to be true to accomplish our mission. That's different than we have to raise more money or we have to fix our branding, right? Or we have to have a great team. Like those are things that support accomplishing the mission, right? So they're all, I think about them as the underlying goals to get to the strategic or mission goals. So again, this is just sort of the categories of things with clues to what kinds of questions you want to answer. Lots of room for discussion about this, but it's sort of what's always in my head that we're building as we go through the process. So let me show you an example of a finished version that I referenced earlier, the symphony. And so I use this one because it's been released publicly and it's a pretty clear example. So, of course, the symphony knows how to make things look nice. So by the end of the day, their communications team took over and made it a really snazzy little document. That's awesome, but not necessary. There was a nice little opening letter from the board chair and the CEO. And then, the first page is really clear. Here's our mission. They used the phrase objective, which was more about sort of what over on the template is a little bit of how we work. We're going to be financially robust, leading orchestra that's fully supported and embraced by the community, recognized by its peers. So it was sort of setting up the sort of set of objectives. And this was partly a previous paragraph they walked around with that they wanted to hold on to, but they knew it wasn't their mission statement. So we wanted to sort of keep it in the mix. And then 4 really clear goals: entertain and educate audiences with opportunities to engage, recognized as a leading arts organization by performing innovative and excellent portfolio with a commitment to American music, including underrepresented voices. Like there was a lot in here that was very precise in goal 2. Goal 3 is to diversify the revenue streams, right? There's, like any arts organization, struggling with how do we pay our bills? And then how do we have a diverse, welcoming, effective organization, right? So in some ways, you could say they have 2 mission goals and 2 support goals. We didn't create that distinction here because for them it was 4 things, right? And in some ways, that page is sort of the guidepost, right? That's in one way all you need. And then what we did is for each goal, we said, okay, if we're going to entertain and educate audiences with opportunities to engage, how will we know we're pulling that off? Well, the audience will grow and it'll be more diverse. There'll be positive feedback and we'll get growth and exposure and engagement with those programs, right? And then objectives are the work we're going to do over the next 3 years, 5 years in this case, to accomplish that goal. Performances, programs, engagement efforts, customer service experiences, thinking long term about our seasons, right? And so you've got a page like that for each goal. So 3 to 5 objectives tied to each of the goals. So again, this is, I don't know, 8, 7 pages long because we dressed it up with some nice photos and stuff. But at the end of the day, not a lot of extra stuff. And one of my goals with people is to say the simpler and more straightforward this is, the easier it is to turn into action and to manage against it. And in a minute, I'll talk about building operational plans. I referenced that at the beginning. What we help people do is take each of these objectives. And what we did was we assigned each objective to a functional lead. Who in the organization is responsible for that? Is that the programming team? Is that the artistic director? Is that the communications team? Like who's got to hold on to that objective? And then we built functional work plans that said for each of the objectives you're in the lead on, what are you going to get done this year? Right. So now under each objective, we've got a set of annual, here are the things we're going to do this year. And we can update progress on the objective based on whether or not we're making progress on the work we said we would do. And so that's a simple way to think about how you get to the operational planning level. I want to cover my last 1 or 2 thoughts and really hope we can have a little bit of a conversation. I'm going to go back to my slides. Covered a lot of stuff. This is my last slide. So, comments about working with somebody like me, facilitator in the process, who does the work. I would encourage the most important thing is that you bring in facilitation skill. The difference maker in good strategic planning is somebody who's comfortable, good, and experienced at helping a group wrestle with, have positive and productive conversations that lead to outputs. Um, you know, uh, it's just too fundamental. Lots of people have really good facilitation skills. It's a well-distributed skill in the universe. But you got to make sure you got somebody positioned to do that well. Oftentimes, CEOs or other lead staff have this skill set. The problem is, I discourage that um, when possible, because it's hard to be a really good facilitator of the conversation and be a participant in the conversation. And I feel like CEOs and lead staff need to be full participants with opinions about the future of the work and the organization, not trying to play the facilitator role. It's a difficult thing to do both at once. And so figuring out how to pull that off. Lots of organizations may have a board member who's skilled at this, as long as they're really clear that when they're the facilitator, they're facilitator, not a board member, right? And how do you keep people sort of in the right roles when you do this work? Second is research and analysis skills, whether or not that's all the same person who's your facilitator or another group of people. Make sure you've got the skills you need to look at your data, to look at your surveys, to do some interviews, like what is our real landscape, and figure out where those skills are on your team, on your board, in your volunteer community, or with a professional. Um, Third is somebody who's got smart coaching and guidance, which comes from knowledge of your context. So they know your community, or they know your field, or they've worked with similar organizations. At some point, not in every case, I wasn't an expert on the arts when I went and did the National Symphony, and I found a colleague who was and brought them into the process with me because I knew I didn't know everything I was going to need to know to sit in the room with the symphony professionals, right? And those are the dynamics you got to sort in these kinds of processes, and when you have content knowledge and not. Um, it is not your facilitator or consultant's plan. And I'm always reminding me and the colleagues I work with on teams is we can't take too much ownership of this product. If we take too much ownership of the final product, it is not their plan. So as a facilitator and a consultant, I'm always watching for the moment when the CEO or the staff or some board member says, wait a minute, I want to edit it. Like they grab it, they take it away from me to sort of make it the organization's, and that's actually fundamental to success, right? Don't let the product be the product of an outside person, because that's then you've spent a lot of time and money for a product that nobody inside your org feels ownership or responsible for, and that doesn't get you very far in the end. And then I'll give away my other trick. I've learned over the years working with lots of organizations that the appropriate amount of money to spend, whether this is staff time or an outside consultant or something else, in a plan that's done once to last 3 to 5 years is about 1% of your annual operating budget, right? So if you're $1 million organization, a $10,000 investment, did I do that right? Yes, is sort of a minimum commitment of what you ought to invest to have a quality strategic planning process. Um, and if you think you're going to do strategic planning for $5,000 and you're a $2 million organization, I won't take that project, and I'll tell you, you're probably not investing enough in strategic planning. And if you're a $250,000 organization and you come to me and ask for a big full blown project, I'll tell you, you can't afford me. And I don't want to take that much money out of your budget. So let's talk about how much you should put into this and what are the ways to get it done. Right. So, I mean, for me, it's a useful gauge to sort of how much you need to invest in sort of who you are as an organization. So you can take it or leave it. But um, it's become a pretty easy way for me to tell how serious people are about their planning and or to know where I fit in as an outside consultant. And glad to talk more about that too. Wow. Okay. Um, I am eager to hear some other questions or comments on what I've said. I think we've got 10 minutes left if I'm watching my clock right.
Correct.
So looks like Laura came off, turned her camera on. She must have a question. Let's go.
I do. My camera was off because I'm in Eastern time eating my lunch while listening. But I have a quick question. What have you seen be a good framework for the internal strategic plan. Like I love what you shared from Nashville, but what does their actual dashboard, like how do you keep up with who should be doing what and how do you present to the board? Are people using red, green, and yellow? Or, we get to having a great strategic plan and then we kind of don't look at it for a couple of years and it doesn't ever guide us. And I feel like, what do you use on a monthly basis to guide your work?
So I'm going to show you a version of an organization. I won't share this out because it's an internally facing document, but let me stop share. This will give you an example of what I was talking about taking the strategies and assigning them to functions. So this is a community foundation, and they have 5 goals. So you see here in the blue. So one of them is to increase their endowment while diversifying. They have a set of strategies under that. And this spreadsheet is what they report to the board on. Red, yellow, green every quarter. How are they doing against those? Those answers are driven by updates at each functional level for the things they've said they're going to do this year underneath each of those strategies, right? Some of them have sort of displayed that differently. Some of them have, the strategy's this, here's what we're doing this year, who's in charge of that, what's required, when's it due. So what happens is I actually, with this organization, I still go in and meet with them quarterly, but that's not required. Every quarter, each function updates their sheet, and then the senior team meets together to talk about how that rolls up to this. And that all happens within a couple weeks of the quarterly board meeting, right? So it's built as a quarterly check-in with the plan against the details. So was that clear enough to give you a sense of how we think about that?
Yes, thank you. And so it's just that first sheet that they're giving to the board.
Right. I'm a big believer that the board's job isn't how are you doing on the details of this year. The board's job is how well is the stuff you're doing this year helping get us to our goal. Right. It's the connection point that the work you're doing this year is going to add up. It isn't, was that the right software to buy or the right, event to hold? Yeah. Thank you. Great question. I mean, to me, that's the fundamental value of planning, is that you can then manage against the plan and actually deliver on it, right? And every once in a while, I run into an organization, and about halfway through, I realize, oh, they've actually never managed 2 results before. And if I'm working with an organization and that's true, they'll start to get nervous about what we're writing down, because they're like, oh, we're being that clear and transparent. We're actually going to have to do that work. And so then you have to have a conversation about what does it mean to manage that way? And you have to there's a change management process. How do you get a staff who've not ever been sort of held accountable for results tied to a plan to start to get comfortable that we're going to be transparent about how our work adds up? So culture inside the organization can run into plan very quickly.
Thank you.
My name is Marquita Riggins, and
Hey,
so
Marquita.
I serve on a couple of different boards, and I've seen strategic plans done a couple of ways. And I was wondering, what is the sweet spot? So when we're doing a strategic plan, should it should it be 3 years, 5 years? I've had one that was 7 years, and so it just seems like a lot changes in that time. And so I'm wondering, what is like that sweet spot of, the length of time of a strategic plan?
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for you. My answer is going to be it depends. It's sort of like, where does the organization want to put its line of sight? So I walked into an organization this year that I'm almost finished writing a plan for, and the first thing the board did, the staff was saying, "Look, I'm not sure we should even do a strategic plan. The world is so dynamic and so changing right now. I don't know how we think more than 2 years out." And the board started saying, well, wait a minute. What I want are big aspirational 10-year. Like, what are we going to do over the next decade to change the world we care about? Right. And so we actually wrestled with that question, and we agreed that actually 10-year horizon actually gave us a chance to not be trapped by the current context. right? And to think what might change over time in the long haul. What do we really want to see in the world? And then what we did is we wrote 2-year near term priorities. Or goals. So we have 3 big priorities, and then we wrote 2 or 3 year targets. Like, where are we going to start on our 10-year path? So that was the first time I've ever done that with somebody, but it was a way to react and reflect on how they understood their context, right? Um, Under 3 years doesn't do you much good. You can't set anything aspirational enough to stretch towards. I like 5 years personally because I feel like you can give yourself room to imagine sort of driving some more meaningful change. um, when you get into the operational planning, if you've only got 3 years and you backwards map, you started to shrink the universe a lot really fast. So, but some organizations are straightforward, and you just get glad you're going to be around in 3 years. Good, write your 3-year plan and make sure you're around in 3 years. I mean, so for me, it's context driven. So I don't have a simple rule on it. I have to understand the org to figure it out. Sorry, I didn't give you an easy answer. It's the right question though. How to get it right. Other comments, questions? Anybody want to argue with me about something? Glad to take a debate.
David, what happens at the end of the 3 or the 5 or 7 year strategic plan? What next?
Yeah. So I'm actually, there's 2 or 3 clients I'm actually on my 3rd round of strategic planning with. Um, there's always a sort of, how much do we want to reopen the can of worms, and what does the data tell us we have to do to reopen the can of worms, right? So I'm a big believer that mission statements shouldn't change every 3 to 5 years. If they do, you're not really, I don't know who you are as an organization. So if we've written a good mission statement that's clear, we sort of double check ourselves. Is this what we're up to? Do we need to clarify? Um, Sometimes it's a simple refresh. Let's do a small number of listening interviews. Let's double check our own data, and let's sit with the board and say, look, these have been our goals. Here's the progress we've made. You ought to be able to describe how far you got in the last plan. And how do we readjust the target? Or is something now more important than it was 5 years ago? So I do a lot of work with organizations that work in public education, and you know, public education is fragmenting. The money is fragmenting, the structures and people who are acting on education are fragmenting into smaller pockets and different kinds of structures. And at some point, whatever your opinion is about that, if you work in that space, you've got to take that into account. And you've got to sort of figure out, how am I going to navigate that? So that's going to change maybe how you approach a goal or two. So there's a zone that you can often sort of stay within if you did a good job initially, so that you don't have to re-examine the whole universe. But you've got to do enough double checking to make sure you're responding to how the universe is changing around you. Sometimes I bring the scenarios exercise in really early to say, let's just double check ourselves. How's the world changed around us, right? Or how might it change around us? And sort of use that as a lens to rethink the goal statements. So it also depends a lot on how much turnover you've had on staff and board, right? So if we've had full turnovers on staff and board, I'll often, even if the CEO is the same, I'll say, look, we got to back up because these people don't have ownership of that language, and we've got to get them to have ownership of the language, right? So remember, my marker is, are people engaged in owning the work? And so if I've got a bunch of new people and that wasn't their plan, how do I help them? How do I run a process that causes the new version to be owned and sort of driven by the people in the room? That was a great question. Thank you, Brittany.
Any other questions?
I have a quick one. What is the biggest mistake or the most common mistakes that you see organizations make in this process?
The biggest one is they're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're checking a box because the board said we need a plan, or a funder says we need a plan. But they already think they know who they are and what they do, and they don't really feel like they need to do this exercise. And sometimes I don't figure that out till too late, and I'm frustrated. It usually happens when I start to get frustrated that they don't want to push too hard to ask the right question. So that is easily the biggest miss, that it's being done for the wrong reasons. I would say the second The second biggest mistake is under investing, I mean, relative to size and complexity on the front reflection on who are we and what's going on in the world, and actually looking at data and input, not just assuming you know. Um, and you run into the nonprofits who the senior staff will get in the room, is like, yeah, we know who we are, we know what's going on, but they actually haven't looked at data or information in a long time to check those assumptions, and not being willing to do that just limits the conversations in hard ways. So those would be the two biggest things that I struggle with.
Well,
Brittany,
Dave,
I'll let you
thank you.
say thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And I'm
Thank you.
glad to hear from anybody at all at any time. Send me an email. We can set up a time. I'm glad to hear from anybody. Thank you.
Everyone that is joining us today, please keep an eye out for an email from me. It'll have a link to the presentation recording, a quick 3-question survey, and an opportunity to sign up as a Carey Center nonprofit affiliate if you aren't already one. Our nonprofit affiliate program currently serves over 425 nonprofits across Alabama and beyond, and is a great way to access educational programs, professional development, and networking opportunities. And membership is completely free. Affiliates are also the first to hear about our upcoming events. We are also excited to share information about the Carey Center Nonprofit Professional Certificate. This is an online non-degreed certificate developed in partnership with the Auburn University Office of Professional and Continuing Education and Merit Nonprofit Professional Development. Merit is an anytime, anywhere micro-learning platform that helps nonprofit professionals strengthen 6 key areas: leading, learning, resource generating, planning, managing, and overseeing through 28 different learning paths. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you at one of our monthly virtual programs or in person when our nonprofit training series comes to your part of the state. Have a wonderful day.